March 12, 1943, North Africa. The desert wind howls across a barren ridge of ochre sand. A convoy of American trucks rattles past, their tires biting into loose dust. Near a small cluster of tents, a group of U.S. Army Ordnance engineers gather around a strange Citroën Faux low vehicle, painted a faded yellow-gray, marked with the black cross of the Wehrmacht. It is a captured Volkswagen Kübelwagen, taken intact after a skirmish near Kasserine Pass. Its thin metal panels glint under the desert sun. One American crouches, running his fingers across the flat belly of the car. Another checks the air-cooled engine, puzzled by its silence. A third, clipboard in hand, studies its construction. Light, neat, efficient, yet oddly fragile. Beside it stands a mud-caked Willys Jeep, engine still ticking from the drive. Its windshield cracked, its seats torn, but still ready to run another 100 miles through the desert. The scene is quiet except for the sound of wind and clicking pencils. Two machines, two nations, face each other in steel and sand. One built from precision, the other from necessity. And in that moment, the Americans begin to realize simplicity may have just beaten engineering perfection. In the years leading up to the Second World War, both Germany and the United States were still nations trying to define their identities through machines. Factories were becoming the new battlefields of industrial ambition, and in both countries, engineers worked not just for commerce, but for ideology. For the Germans, the automobile had been elevated to a symbol of national renewal. In the mid-1930s, the Nazi regime promised a people's car, a Volkswagen, simple enough for a worker to afford, yet engineered with the precision of a luxury machine. Ferdinand Porsche, already respected in the racing world, was chosen to turn that vision into reality. His design was ingenious, air-cooled, rear-engined, and capable of traversing rough terrain with minimal parts. But when war came in 1939, the civilian dream was reshaped into military necessity. The Kübelwagen, literally bucket car, emerged from the same design lineage. It was light, easy to transport, and remarkably fuel-efficient. Built on the Volkswagen Type 1 chassis, it could run on low-grade fuel and required almost no coolant, a vital advantage on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. German troops praised its simplicity and design, but also noted its limitations: thin armor, limited traction on soft ground, and poor adaptability to muddy or rocky terrain. Across the Atlantic, a different challenge was forming. By 1940, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps recognized the desperate need for a new kind of vehicle: small, fast, and capable of handling everything from mountain passes to swampy roads. The interwar years had shown that cavalry horses were obsolete and trucks too cumbersome. What the Army wanted was something new: a mechanical scout, a soldier's companion. In July 1940, the Army sent out a call to more than 100 American car manufacturers. The requirements seemed impossible. The vehicle had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds, carry 600 pounds of cargo, be four-wheel drive, and have a wheelbase under 75 inches. Only 3 companies answered: American Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. The Bantam Car Company submitted its prototype first, the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, meeting the Army's 49-day deadline. It was a success, but the small company lacked the production capacity to meet military demand. So the War Department distributed Bantam's blueprints to Willys and Ford. What followed was one of the most remarkable cooperative engineering efforts in history. By late 1941, the Willys MB and the Ford GPW were in mass production. They looked almost identical: simple, boxy, and purely functional. There were no curved panels, no aesthetic flourishes. Every bolt served a purpose. Soldiers loved it instantly. It could climb, swim through mud, and survive conditions that broke trucks twice its size. It was the machine that didn't quit. and for many GIs, it became a symbol of home on wheels. While German engineers took pride in the Kübelwagen's refinement and efficiency, American designers celebrated the Jeep's rugged adaptability. In its simplicity lay its genius, a vehicle so straightforward that a soldier with a wrench and a field manual could rebuild it by hand. As the war expanded across continents, these two vehicles, born from entirely different philosophies, would eventually face each other in the sands of North Africa. There, on a wind-swept ridge outside Kasserine Pass, one would stall in the heat while the other kept rolling. And when U.S. engineers finally examined a captured Kübelwagen, they didn't just see a German car. They saw the very essence of Germany's industrial mindset, and how fundamentally different it was from their own. By early 1943, the war had reached a turning point. The Allied advance into North Africa had exposed not just the tactical weaknesses of Axis command, but the deeper contrast between two industrial systems. One centralized and precise, the other decentralized and improvisational. American supply lines stretched thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Yet trucks, jeeps, and fuel somehow kept arriving in staggering quantities. The German Africa Corps, on the other hand, depended on fragile Mediterranean routes, rationed fuel, and vehicles built for European roads rather than desert sand. The Volkswagen Kübelwagen had been designed for efficiency, not abundance. Its air-cooled engine was reliable in cold climates and maintenance-free in principle. But in the baking North African desert, the thin tires struggled in deep sand. Its two-wheel drive layout meant it could bog down where American Jeeps charged forward. To German engineers, this was acceptable. The Kübelwagen was never meant to conquer dunes. It was a light utility car, not an all-terrain workhorse. But for soldiers on the ground, theory mattered little when the wheels sank halfway to the axle. The Jeep, by contrast, was a brute of practicality. Four-wheel drive gave it traction where logic said there should be none. It could climb rocky escarpments, ford shallow rivers, and bounce across bomb-pitted terrain without complaint. The Willys Go Devil engine was a simple, flathead four-cylinder that could be stripped and reassembled by any mechanic with a basic tool kit. It had fewer moving parts, ran on any fuel the Army could provide, and tolerated abuse that would have destroyed more refined machines. To an engineer trained in Stuttgart or Munich, the Jeep looked primitive. Crude angles, exposed bolts, a flat windshield. To an American soldier, it was perfect. It didn't need beauty. It needed to live. Reports from the front described the vehicle's versatility in almost reverent tones. Jeeps carried stretchers through shell fire, hauled anti-tank guns, served as field ambulances, command cars, and mobile radio units. They could be dropped from cargo planes or loaded onto ships by the hundreds. In Tunisia, mechanics even welded armor plates to their sides and mounted 30-caliber Brownings, turning them into makeshift assault vehicles. The Kübelwagen played its role, too. Light, quiet, and dependable on hard ground. It consumed less fuel and offered smooth handling. German officers appreciated its refinement, especially compared to the rough ride of a Jeep. But, as the desert fighting intensified, mobility, not refinement, became the deciding factor. American units moved faster, resupplied faster, and repaired faster. By the time the U.S. Army reached the outskirts of Tunisia, they had captured dozens of Kübelwagens abandoned or disabled by retreating German forces. At forward repair depots, these vehicles were collected and shipped to ordnance testing grounds for evaluation. Reports from these examinations, some filed as early as March 1943, read almost like scientific dissections. Engineers noted the Kübelwagen's aluminum-magnesium alloy construction, lightweight torsion bar suspension, and clever design choices that reduced weight and simplified production. Yet, they also recorded its limitations: the lack of four-wheel drive, its narrow wheels, and its dependence on careful handling. The comparisons grew philosophical. America's industrial power relied on mass production, interchangeable parts, and field-level improvisation. Germany's relied on engineering mastery and precision machining. Both systems produced extraordinary machines, but only one could withstand the relentless grind of total war. Even captured German soldiers took notice. Some reportedly expressed admiration for the Jeep's durability and speed. To them, it was a machine born from an economy that seemed endless, fueled by a culture of practicality rather than perfection. The Kübelwagen might have been smarter on paper, but the Jeep was stronger in the world that mattered: the mud, the dust, and the battlefield. By the spring of 1943, engineers in the U.S. 8th Army were conducting side-by-side tests of both vehicles. The Kübelwagen ran smoother on flat ground, but faltered on steep climbs. The Jeep roared past it, engine straining but unbroken. One report noted dryly, "German precision is admirable. American simplicity is invincible." That quiet observation, buried in an engineering report, summed up more than just a comparison of cars. It reflected the essence of two nations at war, one fighting to perfect, the other fighting to endure. And soon, those same engineers would translate their technical curiosity into a formal evaluation, a study that would reveal how the world's most advanced industrial nation had been outmatched by a philosophy of simplicity and scale. When the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps began their formal study of the captured Kübelwagen, it wasn't out of idle curiosity. Every piece of German equipment, from rifles to rockets, was examined with the same question in mind. What makes it work? And what makes it fail? The Kübelwagen was no exception. At first glance, the American engineers were impressed. The vehicle's torsion bar suspension, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, was elegant and compact. Instead of the bulky leaf springs common in American designs, each wheel operated independently, giving the Kübelwagen a surprisingly smooth ride on paved or packed ground. The engineers admired the design's mechanical purity, minimal parts, clean assembly, and remarkable fuel efficiency. Its air-cooled flat-4 engine, derived from the Volkswagen Type 1, meant it never needed a radiator, coolant, or heavy plumbing. For a nation short on strategic metals and rubber, this was a triumph of conservation and clever thinking. But as the engineers worked through their tests, the weaknesses began to surface. The Kübelwagen's two-wheel drive system proved its most critical limitation. Even with excellent ground clearance and light weight, it simply could not match the Jeep's four-wheel drive traction on soft or uneven terrain. In muddy fields or desert sand, it bogged down quickly, its narrow tires slicing deep into the ground. The Jeep, heavier and rougher, clawed its way through almost anything. The Jeep's drivetrain was a masterpiece of practicality. A simple transfer case, direct mechanical linkages, and gears strong enough to endure continuous abuse. Its Willys Go Devil engine produced only 60 horsepower, but it was robust, forgiving, and adaptable to different climates. Engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground later remarked that the Jeep's design had no luxury, no waste, and no weakness. It was, in their words, a soldier's machine, not an engineer's dream. In contrast, the Kübelwagen was a reflection of German industrial philosophy. Refinement through precision. Every bolt and hinge seemed overthought, optimized, and carefully machined. The result was a vehicle that functioned beautifully when conditions were ideal, but faltered when the battlefield wasn't. To American eyes, that was the central flaw. In war, machines could not depend on perfect maintenance or ideal weather. They had to endure chaos. There were smaller details, too, each telling the same story. The Kübelwagen's transmission, though efficient, was difficult to repair in the field. The Jeep's was crude, but any army mechanic could fix it with common tools. The Kübelwagen's seats were ergonomically shaped for comfort. The Jeep's were flat boards, easy to replace, cheap to build. Even the fuel systems reflected two philosophies. The Germans designed theirs to conserve. The Americans built theirs to deliver power, trusting that supply lines would keep the tanks full. When the evaluations concluded, the verdict was clear. Simplicity was not a compromise. It was an advantage. The Jeep could be mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands, assembled by unskilled laborers, and repaired in mud with a wrench. The Kübelwagen, though finely crafted, could never compete with that scale or durability. In the end, the American engineers realized they weren't just comparing two vehicles. They were comparing two ways of thinking about war. One that sought perfection, and one that sought endurance. And the desert, as always, favored endurance, long before engineers at ordnance depots put their findings on paper. The real judges of both machines were the men who drove them. Soldiers, not scientists, determined what mattered in war. To the American infantryman, the Jeep was more than transport. It was a companion. It carried him through shell fire, pulled wounded comrades out of danger, and hauled supplies when no other vehicle could move. In letters home, GIs described the Jeep as the little iron mule and our best buddy. It was rugged, honest, and stubbornly reliable. A machine that seemed to share the soldier's will to survive. The Kübelwagen inspired respect, too, but a different kind. German officers admired its refinement and discipline. Its lines were straight, its movement smooth, its behavior predictable. For an army that prized order and control, it was an extension of its doctrine, efficient, obedient, and neat. Yet, for the average soldier, that neatness was sometimes a liability. On the Eastern Front, where mud swallowed entire divisions, Kübelwagens became stranded by the hundreds, their light frames resting helplessly on ruts, too deep for two-wheel drive. Crews had to dig or tow them out, often under fire. American troops, by contrast, could keep their Jeeps running with improvisation and grit. One mechanic in the 1st Infantry Division recalled repairing a shattered axle in Sicily using a rifle cleaning rod and scavenged bolts. "Ugly as sin," he wrote, but it rolled again. The Jeep invited ingenuity. It could be stripped, welded, or adapted with whatever the battlefield provided. Its strength was not precision, but forgiveness. That difference extended to tactics. The German army viewed the Kübelwagen primarily as a staff and liaison vehicle, a car for officers, dispatch riders, or reconnaissance units. It was rarely used on the front line. The Jeep, on the other hand, became the backbone of Allied mobility. It wasn't just a car. It was an ambulance, an artillery tractor, a command post, and sometimes even a weapon. In the Philippines, Jeeps mounted with .50 caliber Brownings became impromptu gun platforms. In Italy, engineers rigged them with wire cutters to clear road traps. In Normandy, medics lashed stretchers to their sides, driving into combat zones to retrieve the wounded. There seemed no task it couldn't do. Even captured Kübelwagens occasionally received a new life under American hands. Soldiers would repaint them, mark them with white stars, and drive them until they broke. One ordnance report from 1944 noted wryly that the enemy builds fine machines, but ours are easier to love. That emotional connection, the sense of trust between man and machine, was crucial. German precision often demanded discipline. American simplicity invited confidence. A Jeep driver could push his vehicle to the edge of failure and still expect it to come back for more. That reliability created boldness. Commanders planned raids and patrols assuming their vehicles would make it, because most of the time, they did. For every German who admired the Kübelwagen's efficiency, there were 10 Americans who swore by the Jeep's soul. The contrast wasn't lost on observers. British and Canadian units, too, adopted the Jeep as standard, praising its maneuverability and toughness. One British war correspondent wrote, "It is the most American thing at war. Unpolished, unstoppable, and utterly determined." By 1943, the Jeep had become more than a utility vehicle. It was a cultural symbol, a moving piece of America's industrial democracy. While the Kübelwagen represented a system that valued the engineer, the Jeep represented one that trusted the worker. It was a machine built not for perfection, but for people. And it was those people, muddy, exhausted, and resourceful, who would soon test both machines side by side in a series of field trials that would turn admiration into revelation. The first formal U.S. Army evaluation of the captured Volkswagen Kübelwagen began in the spring of 1943 at an ordnance depot near Tebessa, Tunisia. The war in North Africa was nearing its end, and as engineers studied the spoils of the defeated Afrika Korps, they came upon one vehicle that stood out from the wreckage. Clean lines, simple structure, perfectly German in its design philosophy. American engineers approached it with the curiosity of craftsmen studying a rival's tool. They noted how the Kübelwagen's chassis was incredibly light, built from pressed steel panels reinforced by folded edges. The air-cooled rear engine fascinated them. It was compact, easy to start, and remarkably quiet. The Germans had avoided radiators and coolant lines, a stroke of foresight that eliminated one of the most common mechanical vulnerabilities. For the first hour of testing, admiration dominated the mood. The car handled well on hard ground. It turned sharply, braked cleanly, and used barely half the fuel of a Jeep. On a straight road, it was fast, agile, and smooth. The notes were glowing. Precision-built, economical, ingenious simplicity of structure. But then came the off-road test. The Kübelwagen rolled forward into a dry riverbed, a patch of loose sand and rock. At first it seemed confident. Then its narrow tires began to dig. The rear wheels spun, kicking dust into the air. The vehicle rocked, sank, and stopped. The driver tried reversing, rocking side to side, even unloading weight. It didn't move. Two soldiers pushed from behind, boots slipping, until the car finally lurched out, wheels whining. When they repeated the same course with the Willys Jeep, the result was almost theatrical. The Jeep bounced down the embankment, tires clawing through the sand. Its four-wheel drive engaged with a low mechanical growl. It crawled up the far side, engine sputtering but unyielding. When it crested the ridge, a few engineers applauded quietly. No one said a word, but the difference had been seen. The Americans continued their trials across mud pits, inclines, and rocky trails. The Kübelwagen performed admirably in moderate terrain, light, efficient, predictable, but its limits were clear. The Jeep, heavier and coarser, simply refused to fail. It could go where no sedan-derived design ever could. By the end of the tests, the engineers' tone had changed. Admiration turned to analysis, analysis to realization. Germany's design was intelligent, but constrained by the nation's resources and doctrine. It had been built for conservation. Less steel, less fuel, fewer moving parts. America's Jeep, on the other hand, reflected the opposite truth. When you can supply endlessly, you build for strength. In war, the vehicle that could be repaired faster, driven harder, and mass-produced cheaper was the one that mattered. And in every category that determined victory, the Jeep triumphed. The final report from the Ordnance Corps noted the Kübelwagen's craftsmanship with respect, but ended with a line that captured the spirit of the discovery. Where Germany built for precision, America built for purpose, and purpose endures. That conclusion marked more than the result of a technical test. It was the realization of a deeper truth. The war itself was a contest between two industrial philosophies, and on that dusty field in Tunisia, the verdict had been written in sand and steel. After the North African evaluations, the captured Kübelwagen was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the U.S. Army's heart of military testing and mechanical analysis. There, in 1943, engineers conducted exhaustive trials, documenting every component with the precision of a laboratory experiment. Their findings would go on to influence not only wartime production philosophy, but the entire post-war automotive mindset of the United States. On paper, the Kübelwagen seemed a masterpiece of minimal engineering, a vehicle with only 985 kilograms of total weight, consuming barely half the fuel of the Jeep. Its flat-four engine produced 25 horsepower, enough to cruise at 50 miles per hour on firm ground. The car's suspension system, relying on torsion bars instead of leaf springs, was revolutionary in its simplicity and comfort. Its underbody was flat and sealed, designed to glide over terrain and even float for a short distance in water. To American eyes, these were marks of ingenuity. Clever, efficient, elegant. But when the same vehicle was driven through American mud courses and steep inclines, its weaknesses reappeared. Without four-wheel drive, its advantage in smooth handling meant little. It lacked torque, traction, and above all, resilience. The Kübelwagen demanded its driver respect the limits of its design. The Jeep demanded no such courtesy. The difference, as one report phrased it, was between an engineer's confidence and a soldier's faith. At Aberdeen, the comparative study became philosophical. Germany's engineers had produced a car optimized for balance, control, and economy, the same virtues that defined their peacetime automotive industry. The United States had built a machine optimized for chaos, born from the realities of a global war fought across every conceivable landscape. Officers attending the test drives noted something else as well. The Jeep, though heavier, seemed to possess a kind of temperament. It responded immediately, predictably. Its controls were basic but intuitive. Clutch, throttle, gear lever. A soldier trained for an hour could master it. The Kübelwagen, in contrast, required understanding. Subtle throttle work, cautious steering, careful braking. It rewarded finesse but punished haste. On the battlefield, finesse was a luxury. By late 1943, the results were compiled into formal documentation. One report summarized, "The Kübelwagen is a remarkable product of limited means and high technical skill." The American 1.4-ton 4x4 truck, however, represents an entirely different approach, one that substitutes complexity with capacity and precision with power. The statement encapsulated more than a comparison of cars. It described the industrial philosophies that would define the post-war world. Germany built fewer, better machines. America built many, good enough ones, and overwhelmed its enemy through quantity, flexibility, and repairability. As word of the Aberdeen trials reached manufacturers, Willys engineers quietly took pride. Their design, once criticized as crude, had now been validated not just in combat but in principle. Simplicity had proven itself as a weapon. Meanwhile, German officers captured later in the war often commented on the same contrast. One, interrogated in late 1944, remarked, "Your soldiers drive their machines like they are alive. Ours drive theirs like they are glass." That single remark, half observation, half confession, revealed what the Americans had already concluded. War rewards what can bend, not what must remain perfect. When the Kübelwagen and the Jeep were parked side by side at Aberdeen for the final photographs, they looked deceptively similar. Small, unassuming, utilitarian. But to those who understood what they represented, they might as well have been two different eras of history facing each other. One embodied control, the other, freedom, and the world, battered by war, was already beginning to understand which would shape the future. By 1944, the lessons learned from the Jeep Kübelwagen comparison had spread far beyond test tracks and field reports. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department circulated the findings among logistics, design, and motor transport divisions. The conclusion was unmistakable. Simplicity was not a compromise. It was a doctrine. Every branch of the American military embraced it. The Jeep became the symbol of a philosophy that extended into tanks, aircraft, and even supply chains. The Sherman tank, often criticized by German crews for being technically inferior to the Panther or Tiger, followed the same logic. Simple to build, simple to maintain, simple to replace. A single Tiger might outgun a Sherman, but 5 Shermans could outlast it. This mindset shaped how the U.S. approached industrial warfare. Factories in Toledo, Dearborn, and Detroit churned out vehicles by the tens of thousands. Assembly lines prioritized speed and interchangeability over delicate precision. Bolts, tires, gearboxes, everything was standardized. If a Jeep broke down in Tunisia, it could be fixed with the same parts used in Sicily or Normandy. Germany, by contrast, remained wedded to its craftsmanship. Even in late 1944, as Allied bombers destroyed industrial centers, German engineers still sought perfection. Tighter tolerances, refined engines, and custom-built components. The Kübelwagen itself, while reliable within its limits, could never be produced in the staggering numbers that the American Jeep achieved. Over 640,000 Jeeps rolled off U.S. lines by the end of the war. Fewer than 55,000 Kübelwagens ever saw service. Captured German mechanics and officers often expressed disbelief at the sheer scale of American production. To them, the Jeep's simplicity was almost offensive. A machine that seemed unfinished, yet refused to die. One German maintenance officer reportedly remarked during an interrogation, "It looks like it was built by a farmer, and yet it never fails." To the American engineers who had studied the Kübelwagen, this irony was the greatest vindication. What had begun as a technical analysis had evolved into a strategic revelation. Industrial democracy could outbuild industrial precision. The Jeep's success also influenced post-war civilian design. In 1945, as American soldiers returned home, they carried with them memories of the small, boxy vehicle that had been their constant companion. It became an icon of freedom. Practical, reliable, unpretentious. By 1946, Willys Overland began producing the CJ-2A, the first civilian Jeep, marketed directly to farmers and veterans. The Kübelwagen's legacy, meanwhile, took another path. Its designer, Ferdinand Porsche, used its platform as the foundation for the Volkswagen Beetle, a car that, ironically, would come to symbolize peacetime simplicity in post-war Europe. In a quiet, unintended symmetry, both nations' vehicles of war were reborn as vehicles of peace. Back at Aberdeen, the Kübelwagen used in the tests was eventually retired, its frame preserved in the Proving Grounds collection. Engineers and historians who studied it in later decades noted how advanced it had been for its time, but how mismatched it was to the nature of global war. The Kübelwagen was built for control, the Jeep for adaptation. This difference in philosophy echoed across all levels of the war effort. It defined how armies fought, how factories built, and how nations endured. In the struggle between precision and simplicity, the battlefield had chosen the latter. The American approach had proven not just efficient, it had proven decisive. When victory finally came in 1945, the Jeep had traveled farther, served longer, and carried more soldiers to safety than any other vehicle in history. From the deserts of Libya to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it had been the silent workhorse of the Allied advance, a rolling symbol of mobility, adaptability, and endurance. In post-war Europe, under Tistin and Tiditize, even former enemies were astonished by the scale of America's mechanical presence. The sight of endless convoys of jeeps, trucks, and tanks pouring through destroyed German cities left a deep impression on both civilians and officers. For those who had once believed German engineering unmatched, the war had revealed a different truth. It was not the complexity of machines, but the capacity of a nation to sustain them, that determined victory. Captured German reports, studied by Allied intelligence, confirmed this realization. One such document, written by a Wehrmacht logistics officer in late 1944, stated plainly, "The Americans fight with tools that seem primitive, yet their strength lies in the fact that they never stop coming. They repair in hours what we must rebuild in days." This acknowledgement was not merely technical, it was psychological. The simplicity of American design had allowed the United States to field a military that could improvise endlessly. When bridges collapsed, jeeps forded rivers. When parts failed, soldiers scavenged replacements. When airfields were overrun, jeeps carried ammunition straight to the front. In every campaign, they filled the gaps that more specialized machines could not. The Kübelwagen, in contrast, was a reminder of Germany's overcommitment to mechanical idealism. Its finely tuned engine and lightweight construction, though ingenious, were too dependent on controlled conditions. In the chaos of war, mud, snow, and endless miles, it faltered. Soldiers respected its comfort, but resented its fragility. Even German war photographers often captured Kübelwagens stranded in ruts, while jeeps in Allied footage seemed perpetually in motion. The U.S. Army's final report on both vehicles, published in 1945, captured the essence of this difference. The German vehicle reflects the thinking of a nation that builds for mastery. The American vehicle reflects the thinking of a nation that builds for movement. That single contrast, mastery versus movement, summarized the entire industrial war. The Jeep's legend only grew after the fighting ended. It became an icon of liberation across Europe. Children climbed onto its hood as soldiers drove through Paris, Rome, and Berlin. Civilians watched in awe as columns of these small, unstoppable machines rolled past in perfect order. To many, they embodied the American spirit itself, practical, determined, and relentless. Even the Soviets, after capturing several jeeps through Lend-Lease, admitted grudging respect. Soviet engineers studied their construction and found nothing to improve upon. A rare confession in the world of wartime rivalry. In Japan, too, engineers studying captured American vehicles after surrender were astonished. They noted how the Jeep's design, seemingly unsophisticated, hid profound efficiency. One engineer from Toyota later wrote that the experience reshaped how Japan viewed industrial mass production, lessons that would help rebuild its auto industry. In the 1950s. In the decades that followed, the Jeep outlived every vehicle of its generation. It became the template for modern off-road design, military or civilian. Its DNA can be traced through Land Rovers, Toyota Land Cruisers, and even contemporary SUVs. The Kübelwagen, though respected in historical memory, faded into the background, a relic of a different kind of engineering pride. In the end, both machines told the story of their nations. The Kübelwagen symbolized mastery over the machine. The Jeep symbolized mastery through the machine. And in a world at war, the latter had proved the stronger philosophy. The engineers who had once stood in that North African desert, comparing two dusty vehicles under the harsh sun, could never have imagined how symbolic their discovery would become. What began as a simple comparison had evolved into one of the defining lessons of the 20th century. That true power lies not in perfection, but in the ability to endure, adapt, and keep moving forward. In the quiet years after the war, long after the sound of engines had faded, the lesson of the Jeep and Kübelwagen remained engraved in history. Two machines, one born of precision, the other of necessity, had revealed more about their nations than any speech or doctrine could. The Kübelwagen represented the old world, craftsmanship bound to perfection, design measured by mastery. It was the product of a nation that believed in control. The Jeep represented the new, mass production, adaptability, and a faith that ordinary men and machines could accomplish extraordinary things when given freedom to act. In every sense, the Jeep was a democratic weapon, built by many hands for every soldier, in every theater. It didn't require brilliance to operate, only determination. And in that simplicity, it carried the essence of the American war effort. Endless ingenuity through ordinary means. The engineers who had once crouched in the desert, comparing rivets and axles, had unknowingly witnessed a turning point in industrial philosophy. The triumph of the Jeep was not just a mechanical one, it was ideological. It proved that flexibility could outlast precision, that simplicity could outfight complexity, and that freedom, in design, in thought, in production, could overcome even the most disciplined machinery of war. Two vehicles, two visions of progress. One would become a historical curiosity. The other, an enduring symbol of how simplicity helped win a world war.